Stripping floors, Part 3, applying stripper, rinsing, and inspecting the floor. The first rule of stripper application is to only work in a relatively small area of about 100 square feet. That would be an area about 10 feet by 10 feet. Once you apply the stripper, you don't want it to dry to the floor, and you also don't want it to set too long. If it sets too long, you can easily damage the floor tiles or the adhesive that holds them to the floor. Working in a relatively small area of about 100 square feet avoids those potential problems. In applying the stripping solution, first apply a relatively thin coat around any wall, door, or furniture edges. This helps prevent the stripper from flowing or being flung where you don't want it to go. In applying a thin coat to the edge, you can use the doodle bug or a long-handled scraper to push the finish carefully into those areas where you have to be careful, such as at doorways or along pieces of furniture. This thin coat also allows you to carefully and safely pre-work these edges. Sometimes no pre-work is necessary, but if the wax seems extra thick around edges, you may want to pre-work it. If you do want to pre-work an edge, let the thin coat set just a short time, and then scrub the edges with a doodle bug stick and pad. If you want, you can use a scraper to neatly remove all the finish in a neat straight line at door edges and other areas where lots of care is needed. Using this method, it is possible to make a nice cut line without tape, rags, or other supplies. With your edges pre-worked, the next step is to liberally apply the stripper to the whole relatively small section of the floor on which you're working. Use the wet mopping technique and the figure-8 mop stroke. Proper wet mopping technique involves dipping the mop in the solution and then placing the soak mop in the wringer. Instead of wringing out the mop, however, as you would for damp mopping, just press the mop against the wringer so that excessive liquid is given a chance to fall into the bucket. If you just take the mop from the bucket to the floor without first setting it in the wringer, you're likely to fling stripping solution in areas you don't want it to go. Your objective is to put the stripping solution down only where you want it. Avoid getting too much stripper around doors, furniture, edges, etc. If you apply too much stripper in these areas, you increase the likelihood of flinging it where you don't want it to go when you scrub through it. As you wet mop down the stripping solution, work backwards so you don't have to step in the stripper you are applying. Once the stripper is down, give it a 5 to 10 minutes to soften the floor finish. Allowing the stripper to set too long on the floor can lead to tile adhesive being dissolved and then the floor tiles coming up. Both new and old floors can be damaged if the stripper sets too long. Review question 3. The first step of applying stripper is to A. Liberally apply the stripper to the area and let it soak for 5 minutes. B. Apply a relatively thin coat of stripper to the edges and then pre-work the edges. Or C. Wet mop the baseboards and edges with the stripper. That's right. The first step in applying stripper is to apply a thin coat around the edges so you can pre-work the edges. This thin coat around the edges helps prevent the stripper from flowing or being flung where it shouldn't go. I'm sorry, your answer was incorrect. The first step in applying stripper is to apply a thin coat around the edges so you can pre-work the edges. After waiting 5 minutes, it's time to scrub through the stripper. Work forward as you scrub. The stripper and softened floor finish become much less slippery after they are scrubbed. By scrubbing forward, you decrease the risk of slipping. To get close to walls and other objects, face them as you scrub. If you face something as you scrub it, you will have little chance of accidentally bumping it. As you scrub, the stripping solution, the floor finish, and all the dirt that was ground into the floor finish are mixed together. This mixture is called stripper slurry. If you notice the scrubber flinging stripper slurry where it shouldn't go, stop. If the flinging is due to having too much stripper in the area, you can use a squeegee to pull some of the stripper away before proceeding with the machine scrubbing. If the flinging is due to other factors, you may want to scrub the troublesome area manually with a doodle bug pad and stick. If you do fling stripper slurry where it shouldn't go, wipe it up before it sets too long or before it dries. This is easily accomplished with a damp rag. If stripper or stripper slurry is allowed to dry onto an object, it can become very troublesome and time-consuming to remove. After you have scrubbed through the area once, scrub it again in the opposite direction. By scrubbing in the crisscross direction, you get spots that may have been missed or not scrubbed enough on the first pass. Manually scrubbing edges and hard-to-reach spots. Often you have to avoid scrubbing too closely to objects because of the risk of potential splashing. In other instances, it is just impossible to scrub certain hard-to-get areas of the floor, such as right under the back of a toilet, under classroom desks that are bolted to the floor, or between pieces of immovable lab equipment. These are areas you probably pre-worked. After you have scrubbed through the main areas of the floor, you can again work manually on these areas with a doodlebug or scraper. This is a good time for doing this since the stripper will have had a longer time to work and the rest of the floor won't be too slippery since you have scrubbed through it. However, your time for working these areas is limited. You don't want the stripper slurry drying back down to the floor you just scrubbed. You can extend your work time a little by applying a little more stripper to the drying slurry, but be careful about this as it makes the floor more slippery. Now it is time to pick up the stripper. Work relatively quickly so the slurry doesn't dry to the floor. As noted, you can mop down more stripper to avoid drying problems, but this is usually not necessary if you are using a wet vac or auto scrubber to pick up the slurry. In the old days, a separate mop and bucket were used to pick up the stripper and slurry, so premature drying was more of a problem. As you move the wet vac forward to pick up the slurry, try to keep the cord in dry areas as much as possible. In the photo on this page, you'll notice how the custodian is keeping the cord out of the wet area. You can use a long-handled squeegee to pull the slurry away from edges and hard-to-reach spots. As you pick up the slurry, pay attention to how the floor looks. Often you can tell if areas of the floor still have a lot of finish that did not come up. If you notice this problem, apply stripper again and repeat the stripping procedure. If the floor looks good, you will proceed to the next step of applying a neutralizing solution. Review question 4. Which statement below is correct? A. Mop backwards when applying stripper, but then work forwards to scrub through it. B. Floor machines can only be worked in a backwards motion, so you must move backwards as you scrub through the stripper. Or C. Stripper becomes more slippery after it has been scrubbed through. That's correct. Wet mop the stripper down backwards so you don't have to step in the stripper. Then scrub through it forwards. The stripper is much less slippery after you scrub through it. I'm sorry, your answer was incorrect. You can operate a floor machine in a forward motion, and stripper does become less slippery after it is scrubbed through. Stripper is a highly alkaline solution. If any of it is left on the floor, new floor finish will not bond to the floor correctly. This can lead to the finish looking bad and to it quickly wearing off. Neutralizer is meant to neutralize the alkalinity of any stripper left on the floor. To apply the neutralizer, use the wet mop technique to liberally but neatly flood the area you just stripped. Let the neutralizer set a few minutes. While it is setting, you can apply stripping solution to the next 10 foot by 10 foot or other relatively small area that you will be working in. One final rinse ensures that all chemical residues get removed from the floor. First, pick up the neutralizer with a wet vac or auto scrubber. Use a long-handled squeegee if necessary to pull the solution away from hard-to-reach spots. If you are using a scrubber for your wet vacuuming and have prepared it by putting clean water in the solution tank, put the squeegee in the raised position, turn off the vacuum, and use the scrubber to drop the water to the floor. Then, lower the squeegee, turn on the vacuum, and use the scrubber to pick up the water. Using a scrubber like this not only speeds up the process, but provides a little scrub action to ensure that residues don't stick to the floor. If you are just using a wet vac, use that third bucket you prepared with clean water. Mop down the clean water, and then pick it up with the wet vac. If you notice your rinse water is getting dirty as you mop the floor, it is a sign that more rinsing may be needed since you are picking up a lot of dirt off the floor. Change your rinse water and rinse the floor again with clean rinse water. Let the floor dry. While one section of the floor is drying, continue stripping the next section of the floor. If more than one person is working on the floor, use of an assembly line method really speeds up the work. While one person is working on the rinsing steps in one section, the other person is working on the stripping steps in another section of the floor. After the rinse section has dried, it should be free of all stripper and dirty water residue. If you see a residue on the floor, or if you rub your hand on the floor and pick up a white residue, then the floor needs further rinsing. After stripping all areas, you will want to inspect the floor carefully before applying any sealer or finish. Areas that still have finish will appear darker and look shiny. Some shininess and slightly darker areas are often normal. However, if the areas have too much finish still on them, putting finish over them will create an uneven layering effect. If this is the case, more stripping is called for. Sometimes it is easiest to just strip the whole floor again. Sometimes the wax buildup is just in low spots of the floor or in isolated areas of the floor. In such cases, spot stripping of just the problem areas can be done. Cleaning up after stripping is an important part of the task. Always plan enough time to clean up. The equipment is relatively easy to clean immediately after stripping. The longer you wait, however, the more time any stripper left on the equipment has to dry, and the job becomes much harder. Stripper that has dried to machine cords, bucket wheels, and other items can become active again when the item gets wet. To avoid this problem, all machine cords, bucket wheels, and any other equipment used with the stripper should be cleaned to avoid spreading stripper to unwanted areas. You can rinse the bucket wheels when you empty the bucket at the mop sink. Use a rag and, if needed, a scrub pad to wipe down the cord. Using neutralizer is very helpful in cleaning up stripper residues off these items. Mop heads used for stripping should be cleaned by rinsing and wringing them out several times. No matter how well you think you have rinsed these mops, they will still have stripper residue in them and should not be used for regular mopping. You don't want a coworker accidentally using one of these mops for regular mopping, so either label them as stripper mops when you hang them to dry or have them dry in a segregated area. Pads and brushes should be washed immediately after being used. Washing them under a quick stream of water at the mop sink is usually enough to rinse stripper gunk out of the pad or brush if you do the rinsing immediately after stripping the floor. Sometimes using a nylon brush is helpful if a lot of stripper slurry is gumming up the pad or brush. Newer stripping methods are being developed. Chemical-free stripping is one of these new methods. It uses a special pad that works to basically grind off the floor finish without harming the floor itself. Special square oscillating scrubbers, which produce virtually no splashing, are also often used in chemical-free stripping. However, the newer pads can also be used with traditional floor machines and scrubbers also. Technically, chemical-free stripping might more correctly be labeled as extremely deep scrubbing, since the process does not involve the chemical breakdown of the floor finish. In most cases, however, the end result is for all practical purposes the same. In some cases, where the finish is extremely old, excessively built up, or otherwise difficult to remove, chemical-free stripping will not work as well as traditional stripping methods. There are numerous advantages to chemical-free stripping. Since only water is used, the risk of slipping is minimal. There is little potential for damaging floor tiles, floor tile adhesive, or furniture. Splash problems are minimal. Rinsing becomes quicker and easier since no alkaline solution is used. With the square machines, you can also get right up next to the wall, so less manual scrubbing with a doodle bug is necessary. Operating the machines is very easy, but the operator has to get used to a slower pace. It may seem like work is proceeding at a slower pace because of this, but numerous steps are eliminated with the chemical-free method, so work actually goes much faster. If you are using a chemical-free pad, do not try to improve the process by using stripper also. Using stripper will gum up the pad and make it ineffective. You have reached the end of the stripping presentation. If you'd like to test yourself on your knowledge of stripping and you're on the Dokio site, you can do so by proceeding to the test section.